So far, in my illustrious YouTube career, I've pushed many agendas. I've glazed Papa Dorn, preached the potential of Ferrus Manus, and most recently, I discussed just how terrifying Leman Russ would be should he ever return in the modern setting. But today, for perhaps the first time ever, I'm going to be doing the exact opposite. Because in today's video, I'm tackling the preaching, bald bearer of the word himself, Lorgar Aurelian.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
But instead of pushing an agenda, I'm going to be putting one on trial. As over the course of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, Lorgar has truly earned a reputation as the weakest Primarch. Or to put it in the simplest cow terms, he's viewed as an absolute bum. He's mocked for his lack of martial prowess, ridiculed for spending more time preaching than winning duels, and is often treated as the Primarch equivalent of a church youth pastor trapped in a UFC tournament. But is that reputation actually deserved? Well folks, that's what we're going to figure out. Today, I'm going to break down Lorgar's feats, statements, victories, defeats, and psychic abilities to answer one simple question. Is Lorgar actually the weakest Primarch, or is that just a piece of Imperial propaganda? So clench your buttholes, it's time to jump straight into the gowl. It's time to power scale. Now, in order to do this correctly, we need to start at the beginning, with base Lorgar during the Great Crusade. Lorgar Aurelian was the Primarch of the Wordbearers, and to be honest, he has never enjoyed the same martial reputation as many of his brothers. While legions like the Luna Wolves, Dark Angels, or the Ultramarines conquered the galaxy with ruthless efficiency, Lorgar's obsession with faith and worship slowed his conquests and ultimately led to him and his legion being censored, causing the destruction of his perfect city of Monarchia, where the Emperor publicly humiliated him and his legion. As a result, by the time of the Horus Heresy, Lorgar was widely viewed as one of the weakest Primarchs in direct combat. And to be fair, there is quite a bit of evidence supporting that assessment. No, like seriously guys, there are a little too many statements backing up this claim. First, for example in the book Wolfsbane, Leman Russ gives a very blunt assessment of his brother when discussing the prospect of facing the other Primarchs. He says this of Lorgar. Lorgar I could spit on and that would drop him into the dirt. He's so weak from all that kneeling.
That's rough, buddy.
So Russ is essentially placing Lorgar at the very bottom of the Primarch power pyramid, just like your favorite fallen cow usually tends to do. Is Leman Russ a power scaler? Oh my god. I wonder who's number one on his list. It's probably himself. But yeah, Leman Russ doesn't even think Lorgar would even be much of a threat because he states he could spit on him and that would defeat him. Now this is definitely a hyperbole, but the point still stands. Leman Russ is not threatened by Lorgar in any meaningful sense in terms of combat, implying that he could probably low or even no diff the man. The same idea is echoed in the short novella Aurelian, where during Lorgar's journey into the Eye of Terror, Karos Fateweaver, the Oracle of Tzeentch, tells him this. It is prophecy. You will not always be the lost one, Lorgar, the weakest of your brothers. That coming from a demon of Tzeentch, who can see all possible pasts and futures, once again reinforces the recurring theme in this video, that Lorgar Aurelian occupies the last spot on the Primarch power pyramid. And fellas, that's still not it. For example, we get another statement from the Liber Hereticus, where we once again see Lorgar, lo and behold, being called the weakest Primarch. Lorgar, though mightier than any mortal combatant, was often seen as the least martial of his brethren. More of a statesman than a swordsman, Lorgar was a master beyond compare with rhetoric and oratory, and wielded these tools with a deft touch. While he could not stand in a duel against any of his brothers, there was none he could not stir with his words. This statement doesn't even just call him weak, it says he can't even stand in a duel against any of his brothers. That means this includes base Guilliman, Perturabo, or Alfarius and Omegon. The other Primarchs I consider in the low Primarch tier. Outright meaning, once again, that he is the weakest. And that's not even the end of it, folks. Even in the book First Heretic, the Custodes bully him, saying, "Our mandate is to stand vigil over the Legion itself, 4 custodian teams bound to 4 fleets. Icus already claims the 47th, and I trust him as I trust any one of you. Let him play watchdog over this weakling Primarch for a while." So not even the custodians are holding back and also calling Lorgar the weakest Primarch. And yes, I know, the custodians usually tend to bully the Primarchs, as they did end up ruining the Emperor's dream. But this occurs during the Great Crusade, and they may think the Primarchs are man-children, but they're not going to be openly disrespecting them unless they truly believe it. So yet again, more evidence points to the fact that base Lorgar may indeed actually be the weakest Primarch.
Are you kidding me?
But even more importantly than getting roasted, Lorgar himself seems to even acknowledge this claim, as he never sought to be a warrior in the same way as his brother Primarchs, nor did he ever dedicate himself to refining his combat skill to the same degree. And as a result, what natural ability he possessed was often outweighed by Primarchs who did refine themselves into apex weapons of war. Lorgar says this of himself in the book First Heretic. Lorgar clenched his teeth. "By the throne, I am sick to my core of hearing those words. I am not a soldier, I have no wish to be one. I am not a destroyer, Magnus, not like the others. Why do you think I spend so long establishing compliance and creating perfect worlds? In creation, I am vindicated. In destruction, Not a soldier? Not a soldier, Lorgar nodded. He looked exhausted. There are greater things in life than excelling at shedding blood. My father was wrong about me. I am not a general like my brothers, and I refuse that destiny. I will not blindly walk the same paths they already tread. I will never understand tactics and logistics with the effortless ease of Guilliman or the Lion. I will never possess the skill with a blade shown by Fulgrim or the Khan. Am I diminished because I recognize my faults? I do not believe so. So base Lorgar at the height of the Great Crusade and heading into the Horus Heresy is simply not a warrior, never tries to be a warrior, and so is truly the weakest base Primarch. Now sure, against orcs and based on Astartes, he would still absolutely dominate, but compared to his brother Primarchs, it becomes far more pronounced. And you're probably wondering to yourself, why the hell does this video keep going if I've already proclaimed that base Lorgar is the weakest Primarch? Well, because that version of Lorgar does not survive his pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. As upon returning to real space, everything changes for Lorgar. Because there, the weakest Primarch narrative begins to fracture entirely, and Lorgar emerges far more dangerous than ever before.
I'm going on an adventure!
So how does this happen? Well, after the burning of Monarchia, Lorgar begins to doubt the Emperor, and seeks a new pantheon to worship, one that is actually worthy of his worship. Following a failed attempt to gain answers about the nature of the universe from his close brother, Magnus the Red, Lorgar ultimately resolves to undertake a pilgrimage beyond known space to uncover the truth for himself. It is this journey that would lead him into the depths of the Eye of Terror. Guided in part by his emerging psychic abilities, Lorgar was drawn towards the newly discovered world of Cadia, convinced that he was hearing a voice calling to him across the void. There he encountered Ingathel, the Ascended, a demon prince who revealed to him what would become known as the primordial truth of the universe. And it's worth noting that even before his journey into the Eye begins, Lorgar's latent psychic abilities begin to awaken in earnest, as he remembers his childhood and the unnatural abilities he possessed that he didn't know until now were psychic powers. We see this revelation in the book First Heretic, as he converses with Magnus the Red. I suffered hallucinations, visions, nightmares, and trances, night after night after night. Sometimes I would wake at dawn to find blood running from my eyes and ears, and our father's face burned into my mind. Of course, I was too young, too naive to realize what I was. How could I know what psychic power boiled within me? Seeking a release. I was not you, to know from birth how to control my sixth sense. I am not Russ, to be able to howl and have every wolf in the world howl with me. My powers always fired in fits and bursts, coming in feasts or famines. I was 8 years old when I realized that some people had pleasant dreams instead of endless nightmares. Nothing could have shocked me more. But even as he journeys further into the Eye of Terror, his psychic powers are still at a stage where they are not refined and still very inconsistent. However, he is still already capable of limited psychic applications, like probing his surroundings for emotion, resisting deception, and even briefly shattering Eldar illusions through willpower. But those are just his psychic abilities. One of his more significant early tests comes in his fight with Angarath, the Unbound, one of the greatest bloodthirsters of Khorne. But even crazier for Lorgar is their fight takes place deep within the Eye of Terror, meaning the greater demon is operating at a heightened level of power due to its proximity to the warp. And this battle is neither clean nor simple. The two clash violently, with Lorgar managing to deflect the first blow, described as striking with the force of a gunship falling from the sky. He responds by hurling the Bloodthirster's own axe back at it, before driving his mace into the demon's knee, and fracturing its leg in what amounts to a decisive opening exchange. However, Angarath quickly turns the tide. A whip coils around Lorgar's neck, dragging him to his knees and across the battlefield towards the Bloodthirster. Lorgar retaliates by throwing his mace into the demon's face. Hey, that rhymes. Shattering bone before striking again to break its axe in turn. The Bloodthirster roars in fury, hurling Lorgar away and snapping his ribs in the process. The fight then escalates into a brutal exchange of near misses, with Lorgar evading strikes that detonate the ground in sonic booms and thunderclaps. At this point in their duel, Lorgar begins to deliberately channel his psychic abilities, forming a barrier to blunt the demon's attacks and opening a window for a brutal counterattack. Yet the Bloodthirster still manages to overpower him, lifting him into the air and biting down on Lorgar's arm, utterly shattering it. Ultimately though, Lorgar is able to break free and land a final decisive blow with his mace, crushing the demon's leg, spine, and backbone before finally banishing the powerful Bloodthirster. So yes, Lorgar does emerge victorious against one of the most powerful greater demons in the setting. Now all you Lorgar haters out there are going to say, wow Cowell, that's a pretty cool feat, but Lorgar still almost loses to a greater demon. How is this form much different from his base form? He's still pretty weak. Well folks, I would like to remind you yet again on the context of this fight. Their duel occurs deep within the Eye of Terror, and Lorgar is not fighting against some slouch Bloodthirster. He is fighting against Angarath, the Unbound, who is stated to be the strongest Bloodthirster, even above the likes of Skarbrand, Kabanda, or Doombreed. This is explicitly stated in Imperial Armor Volume 7, The Siege of Varax Part 3. Varax's dark sky was sundered by lightning and vomited forth Angarath, mightiest of Bloodthirsters, guardian of the Throne of Skulls, most beloved servant of Khorne, come to Varax to revel in its landscape of destruction and death. And Lorgar is still able to defeat him, showing us our first clear sign that Lorgar's weakest Primarch label is not going to last much longer. After his pilgrimage ends, and Lorgar is converted into a servant of chaos, he dispatches Erebus to Davin, where the first chaplain will orchestrate the corruption of Horus, setting in motion the galaxy-spanning civil war that would become known as the Horus Heresy. At the Dropsite Massacre, the Wordbearers would finally reveal their true allegiance. They would decimate the 3 Loyalist Legions, alongside the Night Lords, Alpha Legion, Iron Warriors, Sons of Horus, Emperor's Children, World Eaters, and Death Guard. It is here that we arguably see Lorgar fully embrace his psychic powers that he has spent his entire life suppressing. This occurs in the middle of the Dropsite Massacre, as depicted in the first Heretic. Always, he had bitten back his psychic potential, hiding it and hating it in equal measure. It was unreliable, erratic, unstable, and painful. It was never the gift it seemed to be for Magnus, and thus he had swallowed it back, walling it up behind unyielding resolve. No more. A scream of release tore itself free, not from his mouth, but his mind. It echoed across the battlefield. It echoed into the void. Energy sparked from his armor and a sixth sense unrestrained at last, with its purity perhaps colored by chaos, exhaled from his core. A sound like the crashing of tides in the Sea of Souls swept through the ravine, and Lorgar felt the heat of his own fury made manifest. He felt his unchained power reaching out, not only to enhance his physical form, but reaching to his sons across the battlefield. And there he stood at the heart of the killing fields, winged and haloed by amorphous contrails of psychic fire, shouting his brother's name into the storm.
Oh my god, he's so goddamn cool!
Besides being one of the coolest Lorgar excerpts you've probably ever read, this moment represents the true awakening of his Primarch psychic potential. The timid, self-restrained Lorgar of the Great Crusade is gone. His base form is gone. In his place stands a Primarch finally willing to unleash the true potential of his powers. And this newfound power is immediately tested when he clashes with Corvus Corax, Primarch of the Raven Guard. Now I'm going to admit it, and you guys already probably know, this fight does not particularly end favorable for Lorgar.
You are not one of us.
In fact, for a majority of their duel, Corvus Corax is clearly the superior fighter, as the Raven Lord relentlessly presses the attack, forcing Lorgar onto the defensive and repeatedly overwhelming him through superior speed, maneuverability, and most of all, his martial skill. While Lorgar is still able to land several blows, including strikes powerful enough to stagger and throw back Corax, he does spend much of their battle fighting for survival rather than victory. However, that fact alone is noteworthy for the bearer of the word. This is still the same Primarch who was once described as incapable of standing against any of his brothers in a duel. Yet here he is exchanging blows with Corvus Corax, augmenting himself with his psychic powers, shattering one of the Raven Lord's claws, breaking his nose with repeated headbutts, and continuing to fight despite suffering horrific wounds that would have probably killed virtually anything short of another Primarch. Ultimately though, Corax gains the upper hand and is moments away from executing Lorgar, before Conrad Kurz intervenes and forces the Raven Lord to disengage and retreat. So no, Lorgar does not win this fight, but he doesn't really need to. The significance of their duel is that it demonstrates just how far Lorgar has already come. The old base Lorgar, the one mocked by Russ, ridiculed by the Custodes, and dismissed by everyone's mom as the weakest of the Primarchs, likely dies within minutes against a fully enraged Corvus Corax. But instead, this Lorgar, after completing his pilgrimage, releasing his psychic powers, and becoming more confident in who he is as a Primarch, survives, fights back, wounds his brother, and forces Corax to actually work for the kill. And perhaps most importantly, Lorgar is still not at his peak in their duel. Now you're probably also wondering, why the hell do I say that? Well, because fellas, there are several statements that come after his fight with Corvus Corax that claim that Lorgar has become more powerful physically and psychically, and is now just built different. These statements come throughout the early part of the Hersey following the battle at Istvan V, suggesting that his near death against Corvus Corax was a turning point in his Primarch development. We see this first acknowledged directly in the Book Aurelian, when Horus comments on the changes he notices in his brother. "Remove your hand, Horus," he sent. Horus obeyed, though he tried not to. The War Master's fingers shivered as they withdrew, and his gray eyes flickered with unhidden tension. "You have changed," he said, since crossing blades with Corax. Lorgar gathered his Crozius and rested the immense maul on his shoulder guard. "Everything changed that night. I'm returning to my ship, brother. I must think upon this foulness." This is our first major indication that the duel of Corvus Corax fundamentally altered Lorgar. Whatever happened on Istvan, he both no longer views himself the same way, and also seems to have grown massively in power, as he is seen in this excerpt psychically forcing post-Davin Horus to remove his hand from his shoulder. And it doesn't even seem that Horus can resist these manipulations, suggesting Lorgar's power truly has grown. And although this version of Horus is nowhere near as strong as the versions of the balding menace we will see later in the Heresy like God Emperor or post-Molech Horus, post-Davin Horus is still incredibly strong. as we see him low diff Angron in the book Dropsite Massacre, and he even has this statement from the book Scars, as Magnus explains to Jagatai what Horus has become. Horus has been eaten by the warp. His body is bursting within it, corroding him, gnawing at him from the inside. So even when being empowered by the ruinous Pantheon to a marginal degree, he still cannot resist Lorgar's psychic manipulations. Later, in fact, Magnus even reaches the same conclusion in the same book Aurelian. Magnus struggled to equate the purred assurances of military tactics with his most scholarly brother's soft voice. It all seemed somehow incongruous, yet Lorgar had never looked so bizarrely complete. Gone were the furtive, soulful glances and the hesitations before speaking. The Duel of Corax had done more than grant him scars upon his face and throat. The key word here is complete. Throughout the Great Crusade, Lorgar was plagued by uncertainty. He doubted the Emperor, doubted himself, and never seemed entirely comfortable in the role expected of him. After Istvan, that hesitation appears to vanish. Even Magnus can see that his brother has fundamentally changed. And perhaps the strongest evidence comes from the book Betrayer. When you changed, Horus said it simply, when you fought Corax and left Istvan V a different man, claiming to have defied destiny. When you teleported your warriors onto Fulgrim's ship and threatened his legion with destruction, because he was no longer himself, I traded trust for doubt, when I was no longer certain just who you were, Lorgar Aurelian. I am the archpriest of the primordial truth. The word-bearer's voice shook, just slightly. I am the minister of chaos, absolute. Those are grand words, Lorgar, that mean little without results. Lorgar rounded on his brother. I am who I was born to be. You seek to punish me for no longer being the weakling, the lost one, the Primarch with no purpose. And that really might be the most important statement in this entire video, as Lorgar himself acknowledges that he is no longer the weakling, the lost one, or the Primarch without purpose. From this point onwards, his feats begin to reflect that newfound confidence and power. Over the course of the Horus Heresy, he performs several noteworthy feats with these powers. He can detect Fulgrim's possession before almost any of his brothers, except for Magnus the Red, of course, easily resists Magnus the Red's attempts to probe his mind, heals catastrophic injuries, like being burnt to the bone by plasma fire taken from a warlord titan, throws tanks around with his telekinesis, pulls thunderhawks from the sky, topples a warhound titan with debris, atomizes custodes and automata alike, shatters Wraithbone, and projects enough passive psychic force to kill space marines and human soldiers without even consciously focusing on them. But his psychic abilities are only part of the puzzle, because Lorgar's martial feats begin to improve dramatically as the heresy progresses. His first significant showing comes against the possessed Fulgrim in the book Aurelian. The moment Lorgar realizes that the being standing before him is not truly his brother, he attacks with startling speed. The son that had never found a place in his father's empire was not the same that drew his weapon now. Lorgar was already moving before even the keenest of his warrior brothers knew what was happening. Fulgrim had a scarce moment to draw a breath, to instinctively reach for his own weapon in a futile attempt to ward the coming blow. Lorgar's Crozius mace struck with a bell's toll, echoing across the war room. Fulgrim crashed into the back wall, a porcelain doll and shattered ceramite, and crumpled to the ground. Yeah, you heard that right, folks. Not only does Lorgar act before some of the greatest Primarchs present, such as Conrad Kurz, Angron, Horus, or Perturabo, but he completely overwhelms the possessed Primarch in only a few seconds. Now, to be fair though, this is not really Fulgrim. This is a demon of Slaanesh inhabiting Fulgrim's body, and that creates all kinds of scaling complications. Even so, it remains an excellent showcase of how much more powerful and dangerous Lorgar has become. As their exchange continues, the demon possessing Fulgrim fares little better, as Lorgar is able to pin him in place through psychic force, and even comes dangerously close to killing him before Horus intervenes and orders Lorgar to stand down. Still, while very impressive, possessed Fulgrim is not the cleanest benchmark available. For that, we need to look at the book Betrayer. There, on the planet of Nuceria, Lorgar faces down against Rabute Guilliman in a true Primarch on Primarch duel. And contrary to what most people think, Guilliman does not simply overwhelm Lorgar in their duel, as their fight is remarkably even. Throughout the battle, both Primarchs inflict significant damage on one another. Guilliman manages to crack Lorgar's chest, while Lorgar fractures Guilliman's skull. The text itself even characterized the duel as a stalemate, saying Lorgar's breath caught in his throat. Not because he was exhausted, though he was, and not because he was relieved to see Angron breaking the deadlock, though again he was. The key word here is deadlock. The definition of deadlock is a stalemate where neither side can gain a decisive advantage. That's the novel itself telling us that Lorgar and Guilliman were pretty much even to each other in a physical bout, at least until Angron intervened. But to add even more context to this fight, Lorgar is fighting under less than ideal circumstances. At this point, Angron's ascension is about to begin. The warp is in turmoil, and Lorgar's attention is partially divided by the ritual he's attempting to complete. And so, the result is Lorgar's psychic abilities are not at their full might, which the text directly states. Guilliman's hands scrambled and skidded across his armor, seeking a stranglehold to end the fight quickly. Lorgar repulsed him with a projected burst of telekinesis, weak and wavering with the song still so detuned, but enough to send his brother staggering. This already represents an enormous leap from his base state, going from being widely regarded as an absolute bum among the Primarchs to being able to match Guilliman physically in hand-to-hand combat. And that's with his psychic abilities weakened. Imagine what he would have been able to do at full power. I'll let you draw your own conclusions from that. And immediately afterwards, he fights the Communion, which is the collective psyche of all the World Eater librarians. And Lorgar only struggles for a moment before utterly defeating the Communion, once again showing just how powerful his psychic abilities have become. But perhaps Lorgar's most impressive Primarch duel comes later in the book Slaves to Darkness, where he fights Fulgrim again, but this time Fulgrim is a demon Primarch. And the context for this fight is pretty damn insane. Their battle takes place deep within the warp, on a demon world. So Fulgrim should be operating at a massively enhanced level due to his connection to the Immaterium. Now there is a caveat that goes against Lorgar, as throughout the fight, Zardulyak, one of Lorgar's word bearers, is gradually reciting Fulgrim's true demon name, which weakens him over time. But even with that handicap, Fulgrim remains a true demon Primarch fighting on his home turf. His sight blinked back into focus. Fulgrim was spinning around and above Lorgar, sliding between air and ground, mocking gravity as he cut and cut. Lorgar was moving backwards. His scepter was a blur around him. Thunderbolts flashed where the weapons met. But even with Lorgar's post-human speed, he would have been overwhelmed if it had been a matter of arms alone. The air between them writhed with shadows and shrieking light. Sword blows vanished into folds of light, splinters of psychic ice fell from bursts of fire. Lorgar is able to outlast Fulgrim, as after several moments of intense dueling, Zardulyak is able to complete Fulgrim's true name and bring him fully under his control. So despite facing a demon Primarch deep within the warp, Lorgar is still able to keep pace with Fulgrim in both martial combat and psychic warfare. As their duel continues, he lands multiple wounds, tears through Fulgrim's flesh and armor, and gradually begins forcing the Phoenician onto the defensive. By the end of the battle, it is Lorgar pressing the attack, while Fulgrim is the one being driven back. Now of course, that is not a clean victory, as I've stated. Zardulyak slowly chanting Fulgrim's true name absolutely matters and plays a major role in Lorgar's survival. As with each chain of Fulgrim's true name recited, Fulgrim grows weaker and weaker by the moment, and without it, Lorgar would have probably lost. However, the feat still remains pretty darn tootin' good, as the bearer of the word is able to react to, trade blows with, and repeatedly wound a demon Primarch on a demon world within the warp. For a Primarch that was once described as the weakest of his kin, that is truly a staggering level of growth. Now for the remainder of the Hersey, Lorgar doesn't really do much. He does have a confrontation with Horus, and is beaten quite decisively, like a child trying to fight a fully armed T-70 tank from the Soviet era. However, it's not that much of an anti-feat because Horus is nearing godhood at this point, as he is fully invested with the blessings of all 4 Chaos Gods, and his soul has been recently reforged following the sacrifice of Malachurst in the book Slaves to Darkness. In that state, virtually any Primarch would have struggled. So once again, it's not really an anti-feat. This essentially marks the end of Lorgar's involvement in the Horus Heresy, and the next time we see him in the flesh, he is a Demon Primarch. So going back to the very start of this video, if we're comparing base Lorgar to the rest of the base Primarchs, that is, the unamped, unaltered, and unascended forms of the Primarchs at the height of the Great Crusade, he is definitely the weakest of his brothers prior to his psychic awakening. But after his awakening, Lorgar is far beyond the irrelevant weakling who could be casually dismissed. At the very minimum, he has to sit above figures like Guilliman, Alfarius, Omegon, and Perturabo, which makes it very hard to place him in the low Primarch tier. There are even narrative hints that Lorgar himself believes that if he fought Corvus Corax again, the result would be a lot different. As stated in Betrayer, he, even in his less humble moments, hungered to face Corax again. Things wouldn't play out so perfectly in the Raven Lord's favor next time. Of that, Lorgar was sure. From this, at the very minimum, he has to sit in the mid-tier, potentially relative with Corvus Corax, or maybe even above him. At the most extreme, you could argue that due to his fight with Demon Primarch Fulgrim, he may even sit near Dorn, depending on how you weigh his fight with the Demon Primarch. But his placement is besides the point. Yes, base Lorgar is the weakest, but as the heresy progresses and Lorgar becomes more sure of himself and fully allows his psychic powers to be unleashed, he is nowhere near the title of the weakest. And by the end of the heresy, that claim no longer applies to Lorgar Aurelian. And that could be the end of this video. But the craziest thing about Lorgar is he doesn't stop evolving there. As I said earlier, at the end of the heresy, Lorgar becomes a Demon Primarch, which is an already massive upgrade, but it goes even beyond that. Because apparently in the book Pariah, it is heavily implied that he is either a master, or at least has partial knowledge, of Enuncia, the language of reality. And if that's true, then Lorgar's ceiling skyrockets dramatically, potentially placing him among the strongest of the Demon Primarchs. Now, since I mentioned Demon Primarch Lorgar, I'm going to have to briefly cover his second fight with Corvus Corax. Since I know all of the Bird Boy fans are going to start commenting, well cow, Corvus Corax scared Lorgar into the Eye of Terror. And well, sorry to squash one of the few crowning achievements of the emo Bird Boy, but that's not exactly what happens. Their duel occurs in the short story, The Shadow of the Past, and is very often misrepresented as a clean, dominant victory for Corvus Corax. But the actual context of their fight is far more complicated. At this point, Lorgar is now fighting under normal conditions, as he is actively sustaining a warp portal to another world, and Corvus Corax himself has also changed. Corax is no longer the same Primarch that fought Lorgar on Istvan. He too has changed, and has embraced his true warp nature, seemingly gaining the ability to shapeshift, allowing him to change into a variety of different forms. And no, for the last time, he is not a loyal Demon Primarch. Whoever said that for the first time needs to jump in the cow hole for 1,000,000 years. Like, the text literally says this: I see no demon, said Lorgar, lifting his rod. Come to me, brother. What has happened to you, brother? I have ascended, said Lorgar. He indicated Corax with a twitch of his rod. I might ask the same of you. The Raven Lord strode forwards, intent on Lorgar Aurelian. Kulta'ar and his warriors scattered before him, grateful to be free of his wrath. I am what I always have been, said Corax. I am vengeance incarnate. I am justice delivered. This place, beyond the veil, has revealed what we all are. Underneath the veneer of humanity our Father crafted for us, we are of the warp. So both Primarchs are in stronger variations of their original forms. But even so, Lorgar is not engaging him at his full might. His focus, power, and stability are all split between maintaining the portal and responding to his brother's threat. And from the get-go, Corax presses the Demon Primarch aggressively, using his speed and shape-shifting abilities to force Lorgar onto the defensive. However, Lorgar responds with a large-scale warp-based attack, keeping the fight from becoming a one-sided affair. Into the shadow, Lorgar rose like a fireball, alight with a tornado of burning ruined shapes. Meteoric sigils rained down on the Raven Tempest, cleaving ember-edged furrows through the dense mass. They slammed into the buildings around the bridge arc, shattering masonry, incinerating the corpses of Corax victims. The Raven Lord struck back, hails of flaring claws ripping the air itself, leaving rents through the ruined robe of the Urzin. Each stroke left a shriek in its aftermath that shredded the nerves as much as the talons, shredded Lorgar's immaterial form. Kal'Ta'ar flinched when the sweeping head of the Wordbearer's mace slammed into the chest of his Stormreef foe. The impact was greater than any thunderclap, leveling the walls around them. Both Primarchs land meaningful blows, Corax through rapid melee strikes and Lorgar through psychic force, which disrupts Corax's transformations. But their battle finally comes to an end when Lorgar escapes through his warp portal, and Corvus Corax is unable to pursue. So yes, guys, when you actually break down the fight, this is not Lorgar being hunted down or fleeing a duel. The narrative clearly shows us that Lorgar intended to withdraw into seclusion well before Corvus Corax arrived on the world. So in a technical sense, Lorgar does lose this battle, but it's not a clean defeat or a case of him being run down and humiliated, like many of the memes paint him. So please, please, please stop listening to meme lore and actually read the books, fellas. Part of the reason I made this video is to show that Lorgar really isn't as bummy as the meme lore and reels paint him as. One thing worth stressing here is that a lot of confusion around Lorgar comes from people repeating summary or secondhand interpretations instead of actually going through the source material. Because when you actually read the novels, the picture is a lot more nuanced than the internet's version of Lorgar is useless or Lorgar is an absolute bum. The books consistently show context, conditions, and character states mattering far more than headlines or memes. This is also a broader issue in the lore space, where even some content creators end up echoing takes without double-checking the original text. That's how misconceptions spread. Quotes get stripped of context, fights get flattened into a simple win or loss statement, and entire layers of narrative conditions just get flat out ignored. With a setting as dense as Warhammer 40k, that leads to a ton of misinformation being treated as fact. So if you're gonna take away anything from this video, take away this. If you actually care about the lore, just go read it for yourself. Don't rely entirely on summaries, including my own. Use them as a starting point, then go back into the books, check the excerpts, and form your own opinions. Even if your conclusions end up being different from my own, that's still a stronger position than listening to whatever you hear on YouTube. Sorry for ranting, but with that said, a huge thank you as always to my Patreon and YouTube members. You guys are the absolute bee's knees. Shoutout, Impossible Paul, Tyler Pick 7, Musty, Keydri, Seth Capazilla, Lag, Cunning Karkle, Diomedes 22, Caleb White, Dinkleberry, Jack Roar, Michael Skipper 7277, Ritter S, Anish Chatterjee, Girthquake 72, and Immortally Bankrupt 1461. You guys' support means a ton to me and allows me to do an autistic amount of research on every one of these videos. But that's gonna do it for today's episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Make sure to like and subscribe for more Fallen Cow content. And as always, stay milked, you sexy mother heckers. I'll see you all real soon. And if someone approaches you on the street or in a Reddit forum and says Lorgar's a bum, ask him which version. And if he says, "What are you talking about?" start dropping excerpts like it's hot. We've got to show everyone that Lorgar actually grows a pair after journeying the Eye of Terror. But yeah, stay milked, fellas. I'll see you all real soon.